Hello and welcome to a screencast on the advantages and disadvantages of training types. We've got a lot to get through today, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this page, but just to let you know sort of what the syllabus is asking you to know. You obviously need to know about the positives and negatives for each type of training, and be able to apply that to different sporting examples. So something that the exam board specifically like to ask about is the suitability of the different types of training on specific individuals. So you'll need to know about the advantages and disadvantages of those types of training in order to discuss and evaluate the suitability. Quick starter task there for you. So just pause the video and have a think about sort of what the benefits are, first of all, of a circuit training. You can see a picture above to help you if you need it. Okay, so let's move on. So let's first and foremost ensure that in your exercise books, on your piece of paper, you've got a table like this. So you've got one column which says the types of training, and then the two other columns which say advantages and disadvantages. And as we go through this PowerPoint, you need to annotate your table. Let's first of all look at circuit training, the advantages and disadvantages of this. Now, in essence, first and foremost, you need to be clear that obviously in circuit training, one of the main advantages is that it's simple to complete. And ultimately, you can manipulate the type of circuit to decide what type of fitness component you want to improve and you want to train. So that's a benefit as well in regards to circuit training. Not only that, it's also varied, it's flexible, so it can suit all different levels of ability, ages, and so on, which obviously makes it a little bit more practical in that it's suitable for most people. Not only that, obviously you've got this idea of it's easy to monitor, it's easy to alter. So as I said before, it's flexible. You can change the different stations, and you can obviously show progressive overload during the course of it, and you can alter the work to rest ratio. And finally, one of the last advantages of this type of training is that obviously it can cater for large groups and it can reduce boredom, which is really important as well, especially if we're trying to keep motivated. What are some of the disadvantages of circuit training? Well, there are threefold, really. So obviously we need appropriate amount of space to be able to do a circuit. So that's a disadvantage because some people might not have that space. You need maybe sometimes specialist equipment for that circuit, which might include medicine balls, benches, and so on. And sometimes it can be difficult to gauge what is the relevant sort of work to rest ratio at the start. Moving on to continuous training, if we look at the advantages and disadvantages of this. So continuous training, as you know, it's continued without any periods of rest. So we need little to no equipment. So a simple run is often fine and suffice in this type of training. It also looks to improve the aerobic fitness, so that's a positive if we're trying to improve our cardiovascular fitness. And in essence, you can pretty much run it anywhere, can't you? Whether it be in the local park, whether it be in a gymnasium, for example, on a running machine. So it's accessible to all, and it's obviously simple to do. Okay, so it's a key motor skill that most people are able to complete. However, the disadvantages, continuous training can obviously be seen as quite boring and very repetitive. And if it's repetitive and that's repetitive contractions, muscle contractions, that can cause obviously chronic injuries, repetitive injuries. And in essence, it can also be time consuming. So in order for us to improve our aerobic capacity, our cardiovascular fitness, we need to be doing that for a long period of time in order to see some benefits. And then finally, it might not always match the demands of the sport. So if we're trying to improve our cardiovascular fitness, but we're actually playing basketball where it's high intensity followed by periods of rest, followed by high intensity again, that might not match the specific demands for that specific sport. So we've got to be aware of that. Okay, so let's move on to altitude training. So hopefully you've seen from some of the flip learning videos that I've shown you in class the benefits of altitude training, and obviously they include the fact that they're beneficial for our aerobic capacity once again. So we're looking at long distance runners training at high altitude, anywhere above 1600 to 2000 meters high, and obviously they're utilizing the fact that they have less oxygen, and obviously that they get a higher red blood cell count. Not only that, it says there benefits any athletes that work aerobically, athletes that sustain work for a long period of time. But obviously the disadvantages of altitude training is that not everyone can access it. So it's difficult to complete the training itself. Okay, some people find it too hard, okay, due to those high demands on our lungs. And also it can cause things like altitude sickness, might make us dizzy, a bit nauseous. And ultimately, it's an expensive type of training. We might need to travel there to a specific country, for example, and the benefits can be lost quite quickly. So when we return to sea level, the red blood cell count starts to decrease again. So these are some of the negatives as well. Okay, so if we look at plyometrics next, the advantages and disadvantages of this. So first and foremost, if we look at the advantages, obviously this type of training, whether we're box jumping, whether we're doing sort of high intensity explosive power jumps, it can obviously increase our power. There can be little or no equipment required, so we can do, for example, lunges and sort of jump lunges, bounce lunges, which obviously can improve our power as well. However, some of the disadvantages, obviously we can cause a bit of overstress on specific joints and muscles, and this can obviously lead to injury if the exercise isn't completed with good technique. And ultimately it can cause DOMS, so delayed onset muscle soreness. Okay, so this is the aches and pains that you might get the following day or the following few days after you've exercised doing plyometrics. Okay, moving on to weight training next. Again, if we're looking at the advantages, obviously it can be easily adapted for different fitness aims. So we can obviously try to improve our muscular strength or our muscular endurance, and we can obviously manipulate that on the amount of sets and reps we do, and obviously how hard we work in terms of intensity, so how heavy the weight is. It can be related to all types of sports really, whether we're looking at contact sports, whether we're looking at individual kind of sports, 100-meter sprinters, for example, will need to do weight training to obviously improve their muscle mass and obviously to improve that explosive power and muscular strength, especially when they're sort of accelerating out the blocks, for example. It's obviously relatively straightforward in regards to we can use free weights and obviously the weight machines, and as long as we're sort of gym inducted, we're able to lift something relatively straightforward, and obviously we get strength gains from that. Some of the disadvantages, however, obviously it can increase, heavy weights especially can increase our blood pressure, and that can obviously be a disadvantage and a health risk. So we need to be careful of that, and also the fact that injury can occur if the weights are too heavy or the incorrect technique is kind of practiced. So we've got to be really wary of that in terms of when we're lifting those weights, so that we're not causing stress on our specific joints and muscles through incorrect technique. And finally, obviously calculating 1 rep max, things like that requires obviously a high level of motivation. Okay, so just to kind of break it up a little bit in terms of some of the writing that you've been doing, just want you to think about this question here first and foremost. So how do you know how hard you're training? So if you're in a gym, if you can see the chap there who's maybe just been bench pressing and whatever else, how do we know when we're actually training hard? So again, just pause the video, put a little subtitle there, calculating intensity of training. So we're looking at training zones in particular, but what are the key clues and the key signs? Okay, so hopefully you got that question down and you've branched some ideas out of it. So just to go through this answer really, so ultimately we'll have some physiological changes. So if we're working hard, we'll recognize that through perspiration, through sweat, our body's trying to cool us down. That is a sign that we're obviously training hard. Ultimately, or it can be a sign that we're training hard anyway. Ultimately, obviously, we get an increase in blood flow, our body temperature increases, which may be showing signs of us working harder, and ultimately our heart rate increases, so our working heart rate increases, and that's a sign that we know that we're training harder. Ultimately, it can be our own perception, be our own judgment. So just within our minds, we can have a scale from 1 to 10 in regards to maybe how hard we're working. But this can obviously be sometimes miscalculated and so on, and people's judgments vary, don't they, from person to person. And finally, sort of through muscle fatigue and tiredness. So you know yourself when your muscles are tired, when you're at that stage of maybe giving up, or you're in the 80th, 90th minute of a football match, for example. Okay, you recognise that you've worked hard. So ultimately, muscle fatigue can obviously demonstrate that. But in the reality, obviously, as it says there, we don't know how hard specifically we're working unless we make the calculations to our heart rate. So next couple of slides, I just want you to make some notes on sort of training zones. So first and foremost, if we look at continuous training, obviously we calculate the aerobic training zone using our heart rate as a guide, and this normally involves the calculation of working out our maximum heart rate, so us working at 100%, and that's referred to as 220 minus our age. And ultimately, if we're looking to work in that aerobic capacity zone, that continuous training of trying to get that oxygen to our working muscles, then we're looking to try and work between 60 to 80% of our maximum heart rate. And this is a diagram to kind of demonstrate that, really. So on the left-hand side, you can see the heartbeats per minute, and that goes from 80 all the way to 220. And ultimately, on the horizontal axis, you've got the age, really. So ultimately, as we get older, our maximum heart rate will decrease, and that's why you can see those zones kind of veering from left to right, slightly downwards in direction. But ultimately, we can find out what our aerobic capacity is, our aerobic zone is, by trying to ensure that we work between 60 and 80 of that. Our anaerobic zone, that's where we're looking at explosive power, we're looking at working without oxygen, for example, high levels of muscular strength, that is kind of between 80 to 90%. And then ultimately maximal force, which we'll never get to, essentially, because our body eventually will shut down in terms of fatigue and whatnot, but that's getting as close to 100% as we can. So it's just worth obviously copying that down and in your own words kind of explaining that. And finally, last couple of points to kind of mention to you in terms of weight training, obviously looking at strength and power, low number of reps, but obviously high weights will be essential in terms of strength training. And you can see they're lifting sort of 70% at least and above of your 1 rep maximum. So it's just giving you an example there that you can read through. And in terms of muscular endurance, we're looking at working then lower than 70% of our 1 rep max, and where we might have more repetitions, and that might be between 12 and 15, whereas in the strength and power training, we've only got between 4 and 8. So that's how we can manipulate our weight training based on what are we trying to specifically train. So those two examples, I think, are just worthy to mention as well, and to understand in your note-taking as well. And finally, in terms of intensity of circuits, well, you can see there the correct intensity involves exercising with an appropriate mix of work and rest, as we mentioned before, and that you design the circuit appropriate in terms of intensity based on the levels of ability, the age group, and so on. Now, just to finish off with, really, in terms of the teacher element, the teaching and learning, just a couple of things, really. So this is an easy question. This is a question that they do like to ask at the GCSE exam, really. So it's looking to evaluate the suitability of circuit training for a netball player, but it could be for any position. So I think it's worth going through this in class with your students, getting them a chance to practice it so they can start to evaluate, okay, so justifying their judgments based on the information that they've got from this lesson. And then finally from me, in terms of how you can teach it, obviously I like to try and sometimes print some pictures off, and they can match the pictures to decide which type of training suits which type of performer. And then also this idea of devil's advocate, so getting maybe a gifted and talented student to kind of debate and argue against the decisions. Hope this helps. Good luck.